So this is Archive Fever at Marischal Museum. Archive Fever is taken from a book of the same name by Jacques Derrida, which discusses the present and future of the archive in Freudian terms alongside Jewish history and the advent of email. So I like the term archive fever. It resonates with my own experiences of archival work and work with museum documentation, which can often seem feverish and at times delirious in its own right. Artifacts not recorded, documentation lost, details misremembered, and changes in modes of organisation and cataloguing across the centuries for which there have been museums. Prior to the advent of museum-based computing, Parry describes how museum documentation practices were heterogeneous and strange, the product of a pre-modern curiosity cabinet style mentality. Now, I think this is an oversimplification, but I do see what he means. Documentation practices across museums can vary quite a lot, but they also share some common similarities. And to suggest that these systems were primitive is also inaccurate. Just as the curiosity cabinet of the early modern era made sense within a complex system of knowing characteristic of the period, though it looks bizarre today, the catalogues of the same time, such as that by Samuel Kieschberg of 1565, also follow their own logic, though it is not our own. By the way, I recommend Kieschberg's Inscriptions, perhaps the first real work of museology. So the archive is feverish, and in exploring it, one becomes feverish too, lost in time and the lives of others long since dead. You come to know your professional ancestors, people they worked with, the people whose objects they held, the discomforting thoughts and ideas they had that do not stand up to scrutiny today, their annoyances and their foibles. And this, as much as anything else, is what attracted me to the archives at Marischal and induced me to start this project that I'm going to talk to you about today, documentary ethnographies. So the study is framed by literature and scholarship on historical consciousness, memory, and hauntology, all of which are connected by a sense of ethical responsibility and care towards the past. The intention behind the use of historical consciousness as a theoretical frame is to recognise and revitalise the important relationship that exists between contemporary museum workers and their historic documentary archives, and to encourage some academic subtlety regarding the writing of past practices in museums. The project also focuses on professional and institutional memory as a kind of moral imperative. It's interested in the identity of an institution built up from a complex pattern of remembering and forgetting over the course of history, and in the moral responsibility we have to do justice to the past. The literature on museums and memory is substantial and varied, though there is a greater focus on personal and community memory, rather than the notion of the museum as an institution with a memory of itself. And it is this latter that this project intends to add to. A re-evaluation of documentation and our collective sector memories of it can provide an antidote to the institutional nostalgia which confines historical documentation to only one space and time, the over and done. And in this project, hauntology in particular is mobilised in the study of the disjointed relationship between contemporary and historical documentation practices and memory, and in the study of the absences of and created by documentary practices. Derrida claimed that the human cannot exist without the uncanniness of the spectre or the ghost. Similarly, contemporary modern digital documentation cannot exist fully without encountering its historical pre-modern, analogue, other. So these are the aims and objectives of the Documentary Ethnographies project: to produce a history of documentation practices at the University of Aberdeen, to uncover the relationships that museum workers have with their documentary resources, to reinterpret historic documentation as a valuable resource in the digital post-documentation age, to conserve the historic records of the university museums. The research questions are as follows. How do museum workers relate to the documentation in their collections? What is the value of historic documentation in the 21st century? And what is the history of documentation practice in museums of the University of Aberdeen? The background to this project actually has a reasonably long history. This is one of the first museological projects I did, if you like, a study into daybooks at a variety of different museums across England. The ones in the middle are the scrapbooks of Richard Quick at the Horniman Museum in London. And I'll mention those again a little bit later. But you can see the variety of documents that appear here. And if you want to ask me any questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. The methods that I'm using in documentary ethnographies are as follows: interviews with museum staff, archival analysis, through which I've discovered that there are lots of things in lots of places, lots of unusual places actually, which I might mention later on. And I'm also looking at conservation and employing a paper conservator for some of the older and more damaged records. But before we get started kind of properly, I wanted to just explain what I mean by documentation and really why I think it matters. On a very basic level, when I refer to museum documentation, I'm referring to the resources which are used to record and manage the collections museums hold. And this can include computerized databases such as CALM, alongside traditional card catalogues, labels, COPECHAT files, MDA cards, entrance registers, accession registers, deaccession registers, daybooks, and collections catalogues. In some cases, this can also include more informal documents, such as inventories conducted during reviews of collections and receipts for purchase, or more idiosyncratic record systems directly related to the collections, such as Aberdeen's slip catalogue or the Horniman's scrapbooks of Richard Quick that I mentioned before. Typically, it doesn't include such documents as museum committee reports, which are less directly connected to the collection, but I do use these for contextual historical understanding. And generally, museum documentation has been understudied as an object in its own right, but it is documentation that museum staff encounter as, if not more frequently than objects themselves. At Marischal, the archive is of phenomenal importance on a daily basis for finding missing objects and understanding object pasts. And even today, the 1912 catalogue acts as a significant reference tool for our colleagues at Marischal. All the way back in 1992, Eileen Hooper Greenhill noted that this lack of consideration leaves museum documentation, its history, practice and theory, as something of a black box in the back room, if you like. And though there are increasing numbers of publications which place documentation centrally, such as Hannah Turner's recent Catalogue in Culture or Crumptich and Somerville's Effective Presence, the Metonymical Catalogue, usually even these use documentation as a conduit through which to explore something else: the colonial operations of museum bureaucracies or the absence of effect in the archive. Literature which does focus on documentation in its own right is often rather dated now. Roberts 1985 and Abelstead 1987, for instance, related as much as it is to the development of computing and professional standards such as Spectrum. They also tend to be practical handbooks, prescriptive rather than descriptive, and presuming that meaning lies only in the process or outcome, not in the product or the culture surrounding it. Jeff Swinney's What Do We Know About What We Know understands the museum register as an interpretable artefact in its own right, and it is from here that I've taken much of my inspiration for my understanding of the museum archive as artefact, complete and glowing with meaning. Museum archives, as much as the museums in which they are hosted, are, to paraphrase Susan Crane, sites of interaction between information and knowledge production, and in understanding them as such effective venues, as evidence of ways of knowing and historically located systems of understanding, we can come to understand more about our own practice. In this section, I wanted to really introduce you to some of the treasures from the archive. And I'm using the question, what glows to you, to frame this, as you will have noticed if I interviewed you as part of this project. What glows to you came out of work conducted by Maggie McClure, who considers the possibility of generating wonder out of data. She calls the fascinating intensity that appears to emanate from some pieces of data the glow. A museum archive would seem an ideal place to find such glows, particularly a fevered and delirious one. So below, I want to highlight a couple of specific cases of data glowing in Marischal College. But before that, I want to just take you through a very brief history of collecting and specifically documentation at the University of Aberdeen. There's a bit of a tendency in discussions of the history of the museum at UOA to start with R.W. Reid and name him the father of the museum proper. And it's an understandable argument to make. He's a significant figure in the shape of the museum at Marischal as it appears today. But the history of collecting, and indeed museums at the universities of Aberdeen, King's, Marischal and Christ's, go back much further than Reid's appointment as Professor of Anatomy in 1889. Side note, this is also the year that the Museums Association was formed in the UK. The history of collecting actually goes all the way back to the beginning, in fact, back to 1495. So what's happening at the universities in the 16th century? Well, as Neil notes in his brief history, they attracted a number of gifts, like many institutions of their kind, and these are enumerated in an inventory list of 1542, which is not dissimilar actually to a collections record of today, dealing as it does with the description, provenance and location of items. And the opening of the inventory reads as on the slide here: a register of all the vessels of silver, brass and iron, and of copes and other ornaments of the church and altars, also of vestments and arras, of cushions and other goods of King's College, Aberdeen, contained in the church, bell tower, hall and rooms of the same college, compiled in a visitation made by the venerable and eminent men, Masters James Strachan, Prebendary of Belhelvie, Rector of Aberdeen University, Alexander Galloway, Prebendary of Kinkell, Alexander Spittle, Prebendary of Clat, James Warwin, Prebendary of Oyen, and John Elphinstone, Prebendary of Invernocty, Canons of Aberdeen in the year of our Lord, 1542. In an article from 2013 titled The Gazophylaceum, Christina Smaraglia argues that the collecting religious institutions of the Middle Ages can be seen as the first museums of the West in a modern sense, with their use of documentation, visual imagery, the display of objects, and their processional uses of space. I don't really know if I agree, but I do see the purpose in her argument. And it's certainly the case that although the items detailed here are typically of an ecclesiastical nature, their documentation in this way is not dissimilar in purpose to our own collections recording practices, and very similar, in fact, to William Knight's inventory of the museum 300 years later, which we'll discuss in a moment. Though many of these items were dispersed during the Reformation and possibly by Alexander Anderson, sub-principal at King's during the 1550s, some were retained, and the jewel house built by William Stewart persisted all the way up until 1725. You can see it here in this section of a map from 1661. It's the image just to the front of the chapel here. If anyone has any further feedback on the jewel house, I would be really pleased to hear it. It's currently a little bit of a mystery to me, and in my experience, it's quite an unusual choice of name for a building like this at an educational or ecclesiastical institution. The impact of the Reformation on kings, at least, was profound, with the deposition of many of the regents as popish and leading to the formation of a new foundation charter in 1592, just before the formation of Marischal College in 1593. As a consequence, libraries would typically be the focus of collection for much of the 17th century at both institutions, and we'll mention the connections between the museums and the libraries later. Between 1641 and 1661, the colleges were united as the Caroline University by Charles I of Scotland, and it was during this period that a collection of buildings were built at King's, including in particular the interestingly named Timber Muses, described by Oram as Little Chambers, and Cromwell's Tower, which still exists today, both in 1658. According to Ogston and Carlow's book on the history of King's and its buildings, these lasted until around 1825. There's not a lot of information available on the Timber Muses, and once again, I'm appealing to you for help. It's such an interesting name, and I can't leave it alone, I'm afraid. Much of the rest of this period is characterised by unrest, including the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the Jacobite Uprising of 1715, and at present I lack documentation for this period, apart from a document from 1658 relating to the new work at King's College, the Cromwell's Tower and the Timber Muses. which appears to be mostly a list of donors and traders. So I want to return to the universities and their collections in the really interesting period of the 18th century, the start of the Age of Enlightenment and the start of the age of the modern museum. By 1725, Bishop Stuart's library and jewel house were in a sorry state of repair at around 200 years old. They were demolished and replaced with a library paid for largely by a graduate of the college, who was also known as Catalogue Fraser for his almost preternatural ability to acquire books for the aristocracy and royal families. In gratitude, kings awarded him an honorary doctorate and commissioned a portrait to be painted. Now, I note Catalogue Fraser as particularly worthy of mention here, at least partially because he was in contact with Elias Ashmole, who you may know as the person who donated to the University of Oxford what would become the founding collections of the Ashmolean Museum, the first public museum in the UK and the world's first university museum, dating from 1683. And this implies at least a tacit awareness at King's that university and public museums were both possible and positive. Sadly, Fraser's library appears to have been destroyed by fire in 1773. However, between the 1760s and the 1790s, interesting things are taking place in terms of collecting in the Enlightenment sense of the term. During the 1760s, William Ogilvie, complete with the entertaining moniker of the Rebel Professor, who was the humanist at King's, started compiling a largely natural history-based collection, which can be said to be the origin point of our zoology museum today. It's interesting to note in the college minutes of 1768 that the collection of this material had been stunted by the lack of an officer such as the library had for the collection of items. At the time, the library officers were known as the keeper and curator, which are interesting designations. Ogilvie was assigned to be that officer for the natural history collection and was requested to produce an inventory and to remember to hand in his accounts. In 1775, Patrick Copland was appointed Professor of Natural Philosophy at Marischal and took over the role of Professor of Mathematics from 1779. He procured a good number of scientific instruments with which to conduct his experiments and demonstrations to students, many of which are documented in student notes as well as throughout the collection, as well as instruments for an observatory, some of which remain in the collection today and which were so beloved by our late friend John Reed. Now, by the 1790s, Ogilvie appears to have developed a bit of a collecting bug, and in 1792, he requested that he be able to form a collection of antiquities, as was only appropriate for a humanist. He was joined in this request a few days later by the anatomist, William Chalmers, who wished to develop what else but an anatomical museum. Both were agreed by the council. However, just 3 weeks after the agreement, Chalmers suddenly died at less than 50 years old, and the project was aborted. At this stage, it's a little unclear to me if Ogilvie's antiquities collection was also aborted, and when he died in 1819, all of his unpublished manuscripts were locked away in boxes and nailed shut. If Ogilvie did develop such a collection, where would it have been? The regenting system, which was practiced at King's from 1495 until 1800, which is really late, by the way, supplied the professors with manses in which they both lived and taught. Now, Humanity Manse still exists today, and I can't help but wonder whether if Ogilvie did live there, did he also host a collection? And this is totally pure speculation on my part and possibly comes with a great big dollop of romanticism, but anyone with any information on the history of Humanity Manse, please do get in touch. By the 1820s, Old Marischal was in a state of destitution, and some parts were torn down, including Copeland's observatory. However, William Knight, Professor of Natural Philosophy, or what we would today call physics, from 1822, and a student of Copeland's, still used demonstrations and models in his lectures, just like Copeland had. Knight is also responsible for compiling an inventory of antiquities held in Marischal College, which he did between the 1820s and 1840s, publishing the Knight Catalogue of Antiquities in Marischal College around 1840. Now, here is a selection of a list which shows the idea that documenting the collection was really starting to grow in importance around this time. It's comparable in many ways to the list of 1542, though it often does not include as much location data. A further comparison of those two collections of lists might offer interesting information about the relationship between early ecclesiastical inventories and the development of contemporary museum documentation practice. About 15 years earlier, parts of King's College had been rebuilt. Some of this 1825 new work was dedicated to a purpose-built museum, as you can see, and it looks to have been in what is now the Divinity Library, which is also suggested by Ogston and Carlo's book on the college of 2009, and it's described as elegant and galleried. Records remain from this time which detail the need for subscriptions in order to furnish and film the purpose-built collection space. In particular, the appeal and subscriptions from 1839 to 40 and the Museum Accounts Book of 1851, which names Professor John Fife as the curator and Dr. Bauer as the keeper. Both were also responsible for the library at King's at this time. Receipts are also included, which, in lieu of a catalogue at this point, indicate the kind of contents the museum had, including a wide selection of shells and a fish that took a very long time to stuff. The appeal of the late 1830s could be connected to the fact that in 1837, while Knight was making these lists, a purpose-built museum space had been opened at Marischal College, though a room was set aside for this purpose from the 1780s. After all, the colleges were competitive. Now, the Mitchie catalogue suggests that the Archaeological Museum at King's was largely built under the auspices of Professor John Fleming between 1834 and 1845, whom, it is worth noting, got into a bit of an intellectual barney in the 1820s with William Buckland, whose collections are held once again in Oxford at the Natural History Museum. Both were theologians and geologists at a time when conflict between the perspectives of these disciplines was growing. The biggest shake-up of the mid-1800s was the joining of the colleges as the University of Aberdeen in 1860. After this, the colleges specialised more, with arts and divinity located at King's and science and medicine at Marischal. Collections were moved, and the archaeological collection located at King's in the museum buildings of 1825. It's this collection which is listed in the Mitchie catalogue, which is up on screen now, of 1887. And it's worth noting that this bears more than a passing resemblance in order and presentation to the Reed catalogue of 1912. And again, a comparison would be worthwhile. It was here where the Egyptian collections would be established, and where Nora MacDonald Griffith, who could be called the university's first female curator, although she was never officially named as such, would care for the collections in the later 19th and early 20th century. Nora's handwritten records, by the way, are delightful. As far as I can tell, she pays particular special attention to drawing pen and ink doodles of her favourite objects. Around the same time, the facilities at Marischal were becoming outdated. With the reopening of the new building in 1906, they were revised and updated. As part of this, all of the collections were moved from King's to Marischal, and this is where Reed, with whom we began, developed the museum which persisted throughout much of the 20th century. His 1912 catalogue remains a valuable resource, as does the Slip catalogue which followed it. These were primarily focused on the anthropological collections, though there are other catalogues for the natural and scientific collections from the same period. By the late 20th century, the Zoology Museum was established at its current location, and the first professional curator, Charles Hunt, was appointed in 1979. Under his aegis, MDA cards and CopyChat documentation systems were utilised, and by the mid-1980s, computerisation was taking hold, though paper-based documentation systems, or at least the idea of them, would persist into the 2000s and 2010s. And delightfully, there is a collection of completely unused, beautifully bound accession books for each of the collections, which were purchased circa 2015-17. Now, of course, we use Calm, and the museum at Marischal is currently closed. Here is a timetable of the key documents that I've looked at as part of this project, some of which are mentioned here. So you can see that this is a long history of paperwork even before we go back beyond the 1800s. Prior to Knight, however, documentation, which is what we're really interested in here, is somewhat sporadic, so I think that we could argue with some reason that this really is where museum documentation begins properly, with Knight in the 1820s, at least that which remains. Many of the people and documents I've mentioned above emanate that elusive glow, and it is that glow in part that encourages the development of archive fever at Marischal. I could go on forever and ever about the glowing objects in the collection, but I don't have time. Before I get into two specific cases of things that glow to me, a few honourable mentions include Nora's drawings, which I showed to you, a collection of Hunt's MDA cards that I found loitering in a biscuit tin, an entry in the slip catalogue which just reads chickpeas for thirst, and rather melancholically Reed's last acquisitions book from 1932 to 8, in which the now emeritus professor's handwriting is starting to show his age, and in which he has pasted a letter from his friend Reverend Frederick Bowie, who contributed many artefacts to the Anthropological Museum. Later in the book, Reed pastes Bowie's obituary. Reed died a year after the book ends, in 1939. Reed's presence dominates the Aberdeen museums of the early 20th century, even beyond the anthropological and anatomical collections that were his purview. This is at least partially due to his long tenure as Professor of Anatomy and Honorary Curator, a period covering approximately 5 decades. Two individuals, however, have almost as much living vibrancy in the collection's records as Reed does. These are Professor Robert Lockhart and the museum secretary, Anne or Annie Phillip. Professor Lockhart took over care of the anthropological honorary curatorship in 1938, with Ralph Piddington as keeper. Lockhart held that position until the appointment of Charles Hunt as professional curator in 1979. That's a long time. It's worth noting that there's a direct genealogy between Reed and Lockhart via Alexander Lowe, who had worked under Reed in anatomy and taken over as professor when Reed retired. Lockhart would take over as professor of anatomy from Lowe, who was friends and in correspondence with both men. And while there are some documents from Lockhart himself in the archive, specifically a variety of letters and reports, one of which I will note in a moment, he is far less present in the collection's documents overall than the woman who held sway organisationally for almost 4 decades. Anne or Annie Phillip was appointed as museum secretary under Lockhart and worked with him throughout his tenure. She remained for about 6 months after Hunt took over. AP, as she became known to me through her habit of initialing all her notes, is a huge written presence throughout the museum archive. And it's through her, really, that we get the clearest images of Lockhart and the operations of the museum at that time. AP appears throughout the documents in the Marischal archive. She has absolutely no compunction about writing on what we would now consider historical letters, including all over the slip catalogue, the 1912 catalogue, and the Mitchie catalogue, which she had her own working copy. And through both interviews with staff and my own exploration of her appearances, she definitely had her own organisational system and way of doing things. Although precisely how that worked remains a little bit unclear. She's consistently updating and making reference to other documents within these notes, creating a network, web, or rhizome of information. Her notes provide tunnels between different documents, a sense of how she thought about the archival and contemporary documentation as interconnected information systems. Her notes act, if you like hyperlinks across the history of the collection of documents held there. And they're evidence, too, that her knowledge of the museum and its operations was extensive. In fact, so known was this that she was asked to remain after Lockhart's essentially forced retirement. Her notes include updates to information about artefacts, including object and donor data, location or lack thereof, return status, and more. Her notes even encompass references beyond the museum's own documents, thus acting as footnotes to the wider web of information to which the museum had access. You can see some of her notes here. Furthermore, she makes notes regarding how certain complex documents work and how they relate to each other. She transcribes old catalogue data directly onto the slip catalogue and attaches the old document to it. But one of my favourite things about AP's notes are when she writes about various encounters with Lockhart. The relationship has been described to me as complex and tempestuous. She frequently refers to him as the Prof and gives us an insight into his activities, such as purchasing and remeasuring objects. An example is here, and you can see that she's written, Professor Lockhart said the price was £48, but it appears that the cost was 68 here. Apparently this is to do with commission, according to the professor. And when I found this, I just giggled for days. Now, she's not the only individual who writes on the catalogues and documents by any means at all. The slip catalogue in particular is littered with notes and annotations from a variety of people, including George MacDonald and Hunt. The slip catalogue is itself a talk in its own right, if I'm honest, but I think AP is the most recognisable annotator, and she's probably the most prolific. Now, I mentioned above some of Lockhart's letters and notes. One of them from September 1977 is particularly characteristic of the man and details his annoyance that both museum technicians were unable to do their job to his satisfaction due to the temerity of one of them to have a heart attack and the other to be in a car accident. This resulted in Lockhart being forced to clean the top of the cases himself because, and I quote, "women cleaners are not allowed to work from steps." Lockhart writes that if these technicians were working with a will, there would be no need for any attendance. Lockhart also has a bit of a habit of inflating visitor numbers in the museum reports and doesn't always report on objects he deems uninteresting or inappropriate for the committee, or that he doesn't want to be a matter of public record. Through these traces in the archive, one can see the personalities of AP and the Prof that still remain. In documentary ethnographies, I'm especially interested in notions of historical memory, absence and haunting, and tracing personhood and character throughout the museum archive in this way has enabled me to make visible the individuals who still exert an incorporeal influence over the collections in the present. Now, I was first introduced to the Chinese linen coin book, or nunchi as it is inexplicably labelled, by Caroline bouncing out of the coin cupboard with the book in her hands, asking me if she'd shown it to me. She hadn't, and I was immediately bewitched by this strange artefact. The Chinese linen coin book is a collection of Chinese coins of various ages, stitched with red thread into a bound book made of linen and leather. The artefact was so unusual to me, more akin to a philatelic catalogue than any coin catalogue I had seen in Marischal or indeed anywhere else before, that I was determined to find out more about it and went on an initially abortive mission for the remainder of that day, attempting to find out who the donor was and perhaps what its backstory was. But it wasn't until a couple of weeks later that Lees would find a reference to a Chinese cash linen book in a museum committee report from 1945 to 6, with the donor named as Marion W. Ackworth. A little preliminary research suggests that this is Marion Whiteford Ackworth, née Stevenson, who was born in 1870 in Mingho, China, to Reverend John Stevenson, one of the longest serving members of the Inland China Mission, and Annie Jolly. They then moved to Edinburgh. Marion became the third woman to receive associateship of the Royal College of Science and the first to receive such in physics in 1893. She authored a variety of scientific papers with her husband, John Joseph Ackworth, and may also have been responsible for a book called The Great Delusion, a study of aircraft in peace and war, which was published in 1927 under the pseudonym Neon. Along with John, Marion made substantial donations to the British Museum and the Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. And as far as I know at this point, the only thing that Aberdeen has in relation to her is the Chinese cash linen book, which presumably came from her father and may well have been donated to Aberdeen on the basis of the Newnham Davis collection of coins, which is among the most significant in the country. And again, this is speculation and I hope to find out more in the future. But the particularly fascinating thing about this object from a documentation point of view is how powerfully it blurs the lines one would usually build between an object and its documentation. Documentation is so frequently positioned in a paratextual way, something additional to the objects, which are accorded prominence. And yet here, in the Chinese linen coin book, the object and documentation of the object are one and the same thing. How does one separate them, and why might one want to? Does it matter? Calm seems to think so. It registers the individual coins, not the book itself, which is an interesting indication, I think, of how the book is understood. At what point does an object become composite like this? And at what point does an object end up documenting itself? Now, what next for documentary ethnographies? Well, there are those comparisons that I've talked about, looking at documents from different periods and trying to work out how they relate to each other and what they indicate. But there's also the conservation work that I'm planning to do or planning to have done with the collections. And then I'll be writing up the project in 2 articles, hopefully, and also hopefully an open access monograph. And I hope that through this exploration, I've been able to infect you with a little archive fever yourselves. Whichever archives you work with, the next time you go there, consider what glows to you.